Reality is fragile, layers of code, history, and perception. But what happens when one of those layers slip? Welcome to Glitch Reality. Some things aren't meant to be inherited. Not homes, not memories, and definitely not what's waiting for you in the garden. Tonight, we read a story called The Hunger Beneath the Garden. When Daniel and Mara inherited their house, everyone told them that they were lucky. Yes, it was old, damp in places, cold in the corners, the kind of house that seemed to remember every winter it ever survived. But it was theirs. No mortgage, no landlord, no squeezing two children into a tiny flat above a row of shops where windows rattled every time a lorry passed by. It had 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, a long garden that sloped gently away from the back door, and at the very end of the garden stood a tree. Daniel remembered the tree from his childhood. He remembered running around it barefoot in the summer, his hands sticky with melted ice lolly, his grandfather shouting at him not to climb too high. He remembered the great black curves of his branches against the evening sky. He remembered his grandmother standing beneath it with cups of tea, looking up into the leaves with an expression he had never quite understood. It was never fear, it was never love, but something a bit in between. The tree had always been there, older than the house, his grandfather used to say, older than the road, older than the village, maybe. It was massive. Not tall in the way pine trees are tall, but it was wide, heavy. Its trunk was thick enough that 3 grown adults could not have linked arms around it. The bark was dark grey, almost black, in deepened grooves folded into ridges like old scar tissue. Its roots spread through the grass in thick, raised veins. Nothing ever grew close to this tree. There was no weeds, no flowers, there wasn't even any moss. Just bare earth in the place of a perfect circle around the trunk. Mara noticed this first. Bit depressing, isn't it? She said on the second day of their house. Daniel looked through the kitchen window. Their children, Sophie and Elliot, were chasing each other around the garden with plastic swords and a saucepan lid. The far end stood the tree, utterly still. I've always liked it. It's always been like that, Daniel said. Mara turns to him. That doesn't make it any less depressing. Daniel smiled, because at the time it seemed like the kind of thing you could just smile at. A strange old tree in a strange old garden. That was all. The house had belonged to Daniel's grandparents for almost 50 years. His grandfather had died first, quietly in the chair 3 winters earlier. His grandmother the following spring. There was no great tragedy, there was no dramatic final illness. She simply went to bed one night and did not wake up. The solicitor said she had left the property to Daniel because he was the only grandchild who still visited. That was true. Daniel had taken the children there a few times a year, Christmas, Easter, and the odd Sunday lunch. He remembered the smell of gravy, the ticking hallway clock, the way his grandmother locked the back door before sunset, even in summer. He remembered her rules. Do not play near the tree after dark, do not take anything from the garden, and do not leave food outside. And above all, if you hear knocking from the back of the house, do not answer it. As a child, Daniel thought these things were harmless superstitions of older people. As an adult, he barely remembered them at all, until he found the note. That note was in the freezer. Not on top, not taped on the door, but inside of the freezer. They discovered it on the fourth day while clearing out the kitchen. The freezer was one of those old chest freezers kept in utility rooms. White once, but now starting to yellow around the handle. It hummed consistently, a low electrical groan that seemed even louder at night. Mara opened it, expecting forgotten peas, Freezer burned bread, maybe, and old tubs of soup. But instead, this freezer was full of meat. Bag after bag after bag of meat. Clear plastic freezer bags, each sealed, stacked neatly in rows. No labels from shops, no brandings, no dates, just bags of meat. Dark red, pale pink, brown at the edges where the frost had started to burn it. Some pieces were cubed, some were stripped, some were minced down into rough, uneven chunks. Mara recoiled at this. Jesus! Daniel comes up behind her. What? What's going on? Then he saw it. The smell was faint at first, trapped beneath the cold, metallic dents, like a butcher's shop after closing. Maybe your granddad used to hunt? Mara said to Daniel. Daniel frowns, though. He never hunted. Then what is all this meat? He didn't answer. On top of the meat, pressed beneath a bag of frozen liver, was an envelope. The paper had gone stiff from being in the cold. Mara picked it up between two fingers, and Daniel recognized the handwriting before he even opened it. It was his grandmother's. Small, careful, and slightly slanted. The note inside contained only 4 lines. Every morning, before sunrise, one plate from the freezer, place it at the base of the tree. That was all. No explanation, no warning, no signatures, and Mara just stared at it. Well, she said at the moment, that's deeply weird. And Daniel laughs, but only because he did not know what to do. She was a bit odd at the end, Daniel says. Daniel, she was your... Oh, yes. Daniel apologizes. I remember her being quiet. I don't remember her storing and butchering animals in the freezer and leaving feeding instructions for a tree, though. He took the note from Mara. The paper was so cold it hurt his fingers. It was probably for foxes, he said. Mara looks at him. Foxes? Maybe she likes feeding foxes. Before the sunrise? He had no answer for that. They almost went to go and throw all the meat away. That was the first mistake they nearly made. The second was way worse. They decided, just for the sake of curiosity, to do it once. That next morning, Daniel's alarm woke him up at 4:45 a.m. He had set the most noisy alarm as a joke, though when it went off in the dark, the joke felt a lot less funny. Mara was beside him, awake. You're not actually going to go do it, are you? And he replies with a simple, I just want to know. What do you want to know? I don't know. The house was cold in that pre-dawn way. Old houses are always cold, as if the night had soaked into the walls. And Daniel went downstairs in yesterday's clothes and stood in that utility room, staring at that freezer. The hum now seemed louder, but he opened it. Cold air spilled out and crawled under his hands. He took the first bag from the top, cubes of a dark meat, frozen solid. No smell at first, but then he carried it into the kitchen and tipped it onto a plate, and the scent rose. Iron, fat, and something sour a bit beneath it. He unlocked the back door. The garden beyond was grey and depthless. Then the tree stood at the end, a dark shaper inside the dark. Daniel steps outside. The grass was wet under his slippers. The cold went through the soles almost instantly. He carried the plate down the garden, feeling ridiculous, a grown man offering breakfast to a tree. Halfway across the lawn, he stopped, not because he heard something, but because he didn't. No birds, no traffic, and no wind. The world was still. At the edge of the bare circle around the tree, Daniel placed the plate on the ground. The tree looming above him. Up close, the bark looked a bit different than he remembered. It was not simply rough, it was almost layered, folded. The grooves ran too deep, some of them disappearing into narrow black splints. For one brief second, Daniel thought he could hear something inside the trunk. A slow, hollow movement, like a stomach turning in sleep. He stood up quickly. Right, he whispers to himself as he walks back to the house without looking behind him. When Mara came downstairs an hour later, the sun was up, the plate was still there, but the meat was gone. At first, they blamed the animals. It was the obvious answer. Foxes, badgers, cats, someone had gone along, taken the meat, and gone. But there were no tracks in the soil, no drag marks, no scraps. The plate was clean. Not licked clean, but clean, like it had been washed. Mara said nothing for a very long time. Then she picked up the plate, carried it inside, and put it straight in the sink. We're not going to do that again. And Daniel agreed. And for 2 days following that, they didn't. But on the first night they didn't do it, they heard a scratching coming from the back of the house. It wasn't loud, it wasn't frantic, just a slow, steady scrape against brick. Daniel awoke first. He lay in bed, eyes opening. Listen. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Pause. Mara stirred. What is that? Branches, he said. But he knew the tree was too far from the house. That sound continued for 11 minutes and then stopped. In the morning, Daniel checked the back wall. There were no marks. On the second night, Sophie came into their room crying. She was 6 years old, small for her age, with hair that tangled no matter how often Mara brushed it. There's something tapping on my window. Daniel sits up. What? My window. There's something tapping on my window. Her bedroom was on the first floor, at the back of the house. Daniel went with her, turning on lights as he moved through the hallway. Sophie's room was empty. The curtains were half open. Beyond the glass, the garden lay silver beneath the moon. The tree stood at the end, motionless. Daniel checked the window, and the latch was locked. There's no one there, sweetheart. Sophie clung to his leg. But I heard it. What did it sound like? She looked at the window. Like fingernails. Daniel slept quite badly after that. On the third morning, Mara awoke and found soil in the kitchen. Not much, just a scatter of dark crumbs near the back door. She swept it up without comment. On the fourth morning, Elliot asked why the tree had hands. He was 4. Still young enough to say things without understanding their effect. They were eating cereal at the kitchen table when he said this, and Mara froze. Daniel lowers his mug. Why'd you say that, mate? Elliot pointed through the window with his spoon. The tree. It has hands. Daniel looks. The tree looked exactly how it had the day before. Black trunk, wide branches, bare earth beneath. No, it doesn't, Sophie says. It does at night, Elliot replies. Mara pushes back her chair. That is enough. But Elliot kept stepping out in the garden. The tree waves at me. That was the morning Daniel decided to go back to the freezer. He told himself he only wanted to check something. And he opened the lid. The meat was still there, still stacked in neat rows, Except now he noticed the labels, not on the bags, but under them. Small scraps of masking tape pressed against the bottom of the freezer, each one marked with a number. Not dates, numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way down. He moved bags aside, his fingers burning from the cold. At the bottom, beneath the layers of meat, was a second envelope. This one was even older. This paper had browned at the edges. The ink had faded. It was his granddad's writing. Daniel opened it, standing in the utility room, the freezer lid propped against his shoulder. The letter reads, "If you are reading this, then we are gone, and the house is yours. Do not sell it without preparing the next owner. Do not remove the freezer. Do not cut the tree. Feed it before sunrise every morning. It sleeps better when it's fed. It stays rooted when it's fed. If you miss a morning, give it twice as much the next day. If you miss two, leave the house before it's dark. And if you miss three, it will choose for itself." Daniel read the final line 3 times. It will choose for itself. Behind him, from somewhere beyond the kitchen window, became a soft creak. Wood under strain. He turned slowly. The garden was empty. The tree had not moved, but one of its lower branches was now angled a bit differently, closer to the house. When Daniel showed Mara the second letter, Mara did not believe it. Not at first. She was frightened, sure. Daniel could see that, but fear and belief are not the same thing. She read the letter twice and then put it on the kitchen table. "This is insane." "I know." "No, Daniel, this is actually insane." "I know." "Your grandparents were feeding something, maybe an animal, maybe several animals. Maybe they got confused. They turned it into some sort of ritual in their head." "But what about Sophie's window?" "It was all coincidences. The soil. Old houses are dirty. Elliot, he's 4. Daniel nods. Because part of him wanted her to be right. Most of him wanted her to be right. But when he looked through the kitchen window, he saw the tree standing there at the far end of the garden, and for the first time of his life, he felt like it was looking back. So they resumed feeding it the next morning. 1 plate from the freezer before sunrise. Daniel did this alone. The meat was still frozen when he placed it at the base of the trunk, and he stood back and he waited, but nothing happened. The soil shifted slightly, just slightly, and the plate sank down half an inch. Daniel stopped breathing. A root had just moved. Not like a snake, not quickly, but it rose through the dirt with awful patience, pushing the soil aside like damp clumps. It was thick as his wrist, black and ridged, its surface threaded with pale fibers, and it reached the plate. Then another root emerges, and then another, and they curl round the meat. Daniel heard a wet cracking sound as frozen pieces were broken apart. The roots tightened. The meat disappeared into the earth, not dragged, but absorbed. The soil opened in a thin, dark seams, and the roots pressed the meat down beneath them. The soil was soft, moist, intimate, like chewing with a closed mouth. Daniel staggered backwards. One root had paused. Its tip lifted, turned towards it. There was no eyes, no face, no mouth, but Daniel knew he had been noticed. He quickly ran back to the house. That morning, he told Mara everything. She cried then, not loudly, but just sat at the kitchen table with one hand over her mouth while Sophie and Elliot watched cartoons in the other room. What do we do? Daniel looks at the freezer. We keep feeding it. But for how long? Forever. For 3 weeks, the routine held. Every morning, he would wake up at 4:45. He took a bag of meat from the freezer, placed it on a plate, and carried it across the wet grass, setting it down in front of the tree and walking away before the roots began to move. By the second week, he had stopped looking. By the third, he had stopped shaking. That was the worst part. Not the fear, the adjustment. Humans can almost grow to understand anything if survival requires it. Mara stopped asking where the meat came from. Daniel stopped wondering how much was left. The children were told not to go near the tree. Sophie had listened, and Elliot had not. He had become fascinated by it. Daniel caught him staring it out the kitchen window. What are you doing? Elliot doesn't turn around. It knows my name. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. What do you mean? It says it when I'm sleeping. Mara took Elliot to their bed that night. They locked all the windows. They pushed a chair beneath the back door handle, and Daniel sat awake until dawn with a kitchen knife in his lap. But nothing had happened. The next morning, the freezer was almost empty. That's when the panic returned. Daniel began to count the bags. 7, then 6, then 5. He drove to the supermarket and bought every discounted pack of meat he could find. Chicken thighs, beef mince, liver, pork shoulder. The tree took none of it. The plate remained untouched. The supermarket meat sat there until flies gathered on it. The next morning, Daniel placed one of the older freezer bags beside it. By the sun rose, the old meat was gone, and the new meat remained. Mara vomited in the sink when he told her. It knows, she said. Daniel nods. It knows what it wants. The last bag from the freezer was used on the Thursday. Daniel remembered that clearly, not because of the date, but because it rained. Heavy, cold, the kind that turns grass black and fills the gutters with a constant rush. He carried the final plate down the garden in his coat and slippers. The tree was almost drinking the rain. That's the only way he could describe it. The bark seemed darker than usual, swollen with wet. The roots were merely exposed, rising from the earth like the backs of buried animals. Daniel placed the last of the meat at the base. I don't have any more, he whispered, but the tree creaked. High above him, the branch shifted, not in the wind, but against the wind. Daniel backed away. Inside the house, Mara was waiting. Well? He shook his head. That's it. They spoke about leaving. Of course they did. They packed bags, they called Mara's sister, they agreed to drive away before sunset and never come back. But then Sophie developed a fever. It came on very suddenly. One moment she was sitting on the sofa, pale and quiet. The next she was burning hot, shivering beneath a blanket. Mara insisted they could not move her. Daniel said they had to. They argued in whispers in the kitchen while the rain lashed against the window. But then came the knock. 3 soft taps from the back door. Mara stopped speaking, and Daniel turned, and the kitchen went still. Tap. 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 The chair beneath the handle creaked. Something dragged slowly across the outside of the door. Not fingernails, but wood. Daniel picked up the knife, and Mara grabbed his wrist. Don't. Then they stood there until the knocking stopped, suddenly. That night, nobody slept. But everyone eventually closed their eyes. And that was enough. Sophie was taken just before dawn. There was no scream. That was Mara could never forgive herself for. She had imagined later that if it had been a scream, that she had woken up, she would have run, she would have fought. But Sophie made no sound. And at 12 minutes past 5, Mara woke because the house was too quiet. The feverish little breath beside her had stopped, and she had turned. Sophie was gone. The blanket had laid flat. The bedroom door was open, and Mara screamed then. And Daniel woke up to the sound of it and knew something had happened before he even reached the room. But what had happened? They found mud on the landing, small smears, a child's heel mark near the top of the stairs. At the back of the door, the chair had been moved aside. Not thrown, not broken, but moved. Outside, the rain had stopped. The garden was in that pale early morning state, and at the far end, beneath the tree, lay Sophie's pink pajamas top. Just the top, folded neatly, and Daniel ran, with Mara close behind him. The ground near the tree was churned and wet. The roots had risen from the soil in their thick black coils. They were slick with rainwater and something darker. Mara fell to her knees. Daniel saw a small handprint in the mud. Then the earth shifted. A root slid slowly back beneath the ground. Mara made a sound that was not a word. Daniel grabbed her and dragged her away while she fought him, clawing at his arms, screaming Sophie's name until her voice tore. The tree did not move. It didn't need to. The tree had chosen. The grief did not arrive all at once. Shock came first, then denial. Then a terrible animal kind of bargaining. They called the police. Of course they did. They said Sophie had just vanished in the night. They never mentioned a note, they never mentioned the freezer, and they never mentioned the roots. Officers searched the house, the garden, and the fields beyond. Dogs were brought in, but the dogs would never go near the tree. One of them broke its lead trying to get away from the tree. The police found no trace of Sophie. No footprints beyond the garden, no broken fences, no evidence of an intruder. Just a missing child and two parents that were too traumatized to speak properly. For 3 days, their house was filled with people. Police, family, neighbors, volunteers. Voices, questions, symphony, suspicion. And through it all, the tree stood at the end of the garden, waiting. They did not feed it. They had nothing to feed it with. And on that third night, Elliot disappeared. But this time, Daniel was awake. He was sitting in the hallway outside Elliot's room, holding the knife, his back against the wall. He heard the floorboards creak, not in Elliot's room, but inside the wall. A slow pressure moved through the house. The wallpaper bulged. Daniel stood. A crack opened in the plaster beside Elliot's door. Something darker had pushed through. A root. Thin at first, but then it thickened. It split the wall with a sound like bones coming apart. Daniel slashed at it with the knife. The blade simply bounced off. The root struck him across the chest and threw him against the banister. He heard Elliot wake. "Dad?" Daniel tries to stand. Another root breaks through the ceiling. Then another. The house filled with the sound of wood moving where wood should not move. And Elliot screamed. Just once. And Daniel crawled through the bedroom as the door buckled outward. Inside the room was dark, except for the nightlight by the bed. Roots had come through the wall behind his pillow. They wrapped around his waist, his legs, and his mouth. His eyes were wide, confused, and terrified. Daniel reached him. He got both hands around one root and pulled until the skin tore from his palms. "Let him go!" But the root just tightened. Elliot's small body was lifted from the mattress. Mara appeared in the doorway and screamed. Daniel grabbed his arm. For 1 second he did. He held him. For 1 second he believed that strength mattered. But then the wall opened up behind his bed. Not broke open, but opened. The plaster split in a long wet seam, revealing darkness packed with roots and soil. Elliot was pulled towards. Daniel had one of his shoulder nearly pulling out of his socket. Mara grabbed Daniel. Both of them pulled. The roots pulled harder, and there was a sound from inside the wall, deep and hungry, like a tree bending in the storm, like a throat swallowing. And with that, Elliot vanished into darkness. The wall sealed behind him, the roots withdrew, and the home became still. Daniel and Mara were left kneeling beside an empty bed, the nightlight flickering, and then slowly goes out. And that will do it for the story this time, folks. Remember, some things do not need us to chase them, they only need us to stop feeding them. And as always, remember, keep an eye on that glitch, because sometimes the glitch is truth. I've been the Overseer.